Third graders. Today's story is a tall tale, and it is about Johnny Appleseed. And we have talked about tall tales, about how sometimes the tall tale can maybe have started from a real person, but then the story gets told over and over again and it gets exaggerated. And so that's why it becomes a tall tale, because they may describe things that we know are not true. But there may be, there may have been an original character that lived by that person's name. So this is about Johnny Appleseed, and he indeed was a real person. John Chapman, who later became known as Johnny Appleseed, was born on September 26, 1774, when the apples on the trees surrounding his home in Leominster, Massachusetts, were as red as the autumn leaves. John's first years were hard. His father left the family to fight in the Revolutionary War. John's father returned home, and within a decade, their little house was overflowing with 10 more children. Nearby was an apple orchard. Like most early American families, the Chapmans picked their apples in the fall, stored them in the cellar for winter eating, and used them to make sauces, cider, vinegar, and apple butter. John loved to watch the spring blossoms slowly turn into a glowing fruit of autumn. Watching the apples grow inspired in John a love of all of nature. He often escaped from his boisterous household to the tranquil woods. The animals sensed his gentleness and trusted him. As soon as John was old enough to leave home, he set out to explore the vast wilderness to the west. When he reached the Allegheny Mountains, he cleared a plot of land and planted a small orchard with the pouch of apple seeds he had carried with him. John walked hundreds of miles through the Pennsylvania forest, living like the Indians he befriended on the trail. As he traveled, he cleared the land for many more orchards. He was sure the pioneer families would be arriving before long, and he looked forward to supplying them with apple trees. When a storm struck, he found shelter in a hollow log or built a lean-to. On clear nights, he stretched out under the stars. Over the next few years, John continued to visit and care for his new orchards. The winter slowed him down, but he survived happily on a diet of butternuts. One spring, he met a band of men who boasted that they could lick their weight in wildcats. They were amazed to hear that John wouldn't hurt an animal and had no use for a gun. They challenged John to compete at wrestling, the favorite frontier sport. He suggested a more practical contest, a tree-chopping match. The woodsmen eagerly agreed. And there they are, chopping wood. When the sawdust settled, there was no question about who had come out on top. John was pleased that the land for his largest orchard had been so quickly cleared. He thanked the exhausted woodsmen for their help, and he began planting. During the next few years, John continued to move westward. Whenever he ran out of apple seeds, he hiked to the eastern cider presses to replenish his supply. Before long, John's plantings were spread across the state of Ohio. Meanwhile, pioneer families were arriving in search of home sites and farmland. John had located his orchards on the routes he thought that they'd been traveling. As he had hoped, the settlers were eager to buy his young trees. John went out of his way to lend a helping hand to new neighbors. Often he would give his trees away. People affectionately called him Johnny Appleseed, and he began using that name. He particularly enjoyed entertaining children with tales of his wilderness adventures and stories from the Bible. In 1812, the British incited the Indians to join them in another war against the Americans. The settlers feared that Ohio would be invaded from Lake Erie. It grieved Johnny that his friends were fighting each other, but then when he saw the smoke of burning cabins, he ran through the night, shouting a warning at every door. After the war, people urged Johnny to build a house and settle down. He replied that he lived like a king in his wilderness home, and he returned to the forest that he loved. During his long absences, folks enjoyed sharing their recollections of Johnny. They retold his stories, and sometimes they even exaggerated them a bit. Some recalled Johnny sleeping in a treetop hammock and chatting with the birds. Others remembered that a rattlesnake had attacked his foot. Fortunately, Johnny's feet were as tough as elephant's hide, so the fangs didn't penetrate. These are some of the tall tales. It was said that Johnny had once tended a wounded wolf and then kept him for a pet. An old hunter swore he'd see Johnny frolicking with a bear family. The storytellers outdid each other with tall tales about his feats of survival in the untamed wilderness. And here you can see a picture of a fish holding Johnny in his mouth. And then there's a gigantic, some type of cat, lion maybe, lioness, an eagle carrying Johnny, him falling from a waterfall. As the years passed, Ohio became too crowded for Johnny. He moved into the wilds of Indiana, where he continued to clear land for his orchards. When the settlers began arriving, Johnny recognized some of the children who had listened to his stories. Now they had children of their own. It made Johnny's old heart glad when they welcomed him as a beloved friend and asked to hear his tales again. When Johnny passed 70, it became difficult for him to keep up with his work. Then in March of 1845, while trudging through a snowstorm near Fort Wayne in Indiana, he became ill for the first time. Johnny asked for shelter in a shelter's cabin, and a few days later he died there. Curiously, Johnny's stories continued to move westward without him. Folks maintained that they'd seen him in Illinois or that he greeted them in Missouri, Arkansas, or Texas. Others were certain that he'd planted trees on the slopes of the Rocky Mountains or in California's distant valleys. Even today, people still claim that they've seen Johnny Appleseed. And then there's an author's note. Many stories have been told about him. And, he indeed was a true person. He was a real person. And then the stories got exaggerated, and that's how they become tall tales. So, I don't know if you've noticed or not, but I've been wearing the same shirt in all of your stories this week. That's because this is Monday, and I was doing all of my stories today, so I can be working ahead. Because I like to work ahead. I don't like to work till the last minute. And because if I work ahead, then I feel I don't have to rush at the last minute. And so that's always a good thing to do. If you can, stay ahead of the game. Don't wait till the last minute on things. You guys have a wonderful weekend.